Why do you think you're so polarizing to academia? Or everybody, maybe?
Well, I actually don't think I am very polarizing. I think that I'm extremely polarizing to a very small number of extremely noisy people.
Do you have any comments on the Nazi presence at your protest?
Yeah, I don't like Nazis. A genuine question is actually one you want the answer to because you're curious, right?
Yeah, well, this is called Shane Smith Has Questions, and I have questions, but you do, I guess you fight a lot or you debate a lot. Or
Because the leftists should have been the ones that were most skeptical about the bloody pharmaceutical companies. What happens if the cat gets your tongue? Everything goes to hell.
All right.
All right, away we go.
Jordan Peterson, I'm going to just get your bona fides out of the way here.
I have some of those.
You have a lot, actually. You know, this is the thing with being a little bit old, like you and I. We have a lot of things we can say about each other. Clinical psychologist, author, professor, public speaker, podcaster. You talk about psychology, self-improvement, philosophy, politics, religion, culture. You've taught at U of T, Harvard, and now Peterson Academy. A good old boy from Alberta, Canada. I'm from Canada as well. Poli-Sci, University of Alberta, then a PhD in clinical psychology from McGill, which we went to maybe at the same time. We'll figure that out. And then Harvard. What I know you as, what a lot of people know you as a internet personality, podcaster, persona, thinker. Is that all right?
Sure.
Got it.
I don't know if there's a persona, though.
Look, I love talking to people from both sides. I know that I'm gonna get lots of comments just for talking to you, but I find you very interesting. I want to start very light. I think one of our favorite books is Bulgakov, The Master and Margarita.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a three-pronged attack. It's the ruminations of Jesus and Pontius Pilate. It's the devil coming to Moscow, which sort of is a critique on the modern, or at that time, Soviet culture. And then a love story where it's about a guy, master, and his love, Margarita. One of the greatest books ever written. Mm-hmm. And the master goes bonkers while writing it in Siberia, throwing it into the flames, goes blind, and is staring at the abyss. You have said that when you're, quote unquote, looking into the abyss, it is the driver of your faith. What is your abyss?
Well, I've been preoccupied with issue of evil for as long as I can remember, really, since I was about 13. And I came to understand relatively early that studying such things left you with two choices, neither of which were particularly attractive. And one was that you could forego the idea that there is such a thing as absolute evil, let's say, metaphysically speaking, and relativize the problem, but that leaves you in a relatively vulnerable moral position with regards to such things as the Auschwitz death camps or the Gulag Archipelago camps or Maoist China for that matter. Or you could take the problem seriously and understand that evil is a reality, and that if you do that, it really forces you into the theological domain.
Give your lungs a break and try Zippix nicotine-infused toothpicks. Nicotine satisfaction, no smoke, no mess, just a pick. Ditch the cigarettes, ditch the vapes, and get some nicotine-infused toothpicks at zippixtoothpicks.com today. Get 10% off your first order by using the code SHANE, S-H-A-N-E, at checkout, and your lungs will be glad you did. Must be 21 or older to order. Warning, nicotine is an addictive chemical. Zip more, smoke less with Zippix nicotine toothpicks. DraftKings Casino is on fire right now. Download the app and sign in with code SHANE, that's S-H-A-N-E, and take the featured slot for a spin and explore thousands of others on the DraftKings game library. Check back daily to claim the hottest offers and promos on DraftKings Casino. The crown is yours, baby.
Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. Please play responsibly. 21 and over. Physically present in Michigan, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, West Virginia only. Void in Connecticut and Ontario. Eligibility restrictions apply. New customers only. Non-withdrawable casino spins valid for featured game only and expire in 168 hours. See terms at casino.draftkings.com/promos. Ends June 15th, 2025 at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time.
I think it's very difficult to study evil seriously, whether you do that psychologically or politically. So you can think of, the evil committed by solitary purveyors of mayhem like serial killers and serial sexual abusers, rapists, or you can look at political authoritarianism, but pretty much end up in the same place. I don't see how you can study that seriously without it radically altering the way you look at the world.
Mm-hmm.
Now, once you also understand that there's such a thing as evil, it's also extraordinarily difficult not to simultaneously understand that there's something that's the opposite of that.
Mm.
Now, it's not that easy to specify, let's say, but if there's evil, at minimum, getting as far away from that as possible is good.
Right.
Then you're faced with the problem of what constitutes the highest good, and that's really a religious question, almost by definition. So,
yeah, so religious and philosophical, but let's go more to something, let's say, concrete. Bulgakov had his staring at the abyss in Russia. You stared at a physical abyss in Russia, I believe, when you went there and you had some radical treatment for diazepam benzos.
yeah.
And went into a medical-induced coma, had to be intubated. That has to be terrible.
Well, it's hard to describe,
Yeah.
really, or to tell you about it. I don't really know what happened to me. It was a combination of things. There's a very strong streak of depression in my family, which looks immunological in nature,
Right.
from what I've been able to understand. It affected my father very badly and most of his siblings and almost all of my cousins and my grandfather and me. And that laid the groundwork for whatever befell me. I had a terrible allergic reaction to something in Vancouver, on Vancouver Island in 2016. The consequence of that was a prolonged bout of inability to sleep. And when I went to the physician to let him know that I was having a terrible time with insomnia and low blood pressure, I couldn't stand up without falling over, basically. And
they don't know why?
it was likely an allergic reaction, but no, it's not obvious why. Anyways, he recommended both sleeping pills and a benzodiazepine, and I took the benzodiazepine believing that it was comparatively harmless,
Xanax
which was
or
the
Valium
idea.
or whatever.
Yeah. And a relatively low dose, and I was able to sleep in consequence of that, and then I got back on my feet enough to go back to work, even though I hadn't recovered by any stretch of the imagination. And then about 3 years later, my wife got very ill and my life got very complicated, and I was starting to get anxious again, although I had been still ill but relatively stable. And I went up on the benzodiazepine a little bit because of the anxiety. That made it worse. So then I went down quite dramatically, and that really made it worse,
Right.
like indescribably worse. And then that set off a cascading sequence of events that I don't even know how to describe. At the worst of it, I was walking about 12 miles a day because I couldn't sit down.
Wow.
I was in that state for about 3 years.
Yeah, heroin addicts famously say don't touch benzos, which is pretty bad if they're saying don't touch benzo, because first of all, they drive you crazy. Secondly, it's very hard to get off of them.
Yes.
Yeah. And they end up giving you more anxiety, which is what you're taking them for.
They're really not supposed to be prescribed for more than 2 weeks.
Yeah.
I don't blame my physician, I wouldn't say. Some warning would have been good, but because I had had some instability in mood when I was taking the benzodiazepines and things were, I was functional, I could at least teach, I could do my job and more or less function, I thought I'll just leave well enough alone. You know, I'd known enough as a clinical psychologist that if you're fortunate enough to establish some degree of stability in someone with a mood disorder, it's better not to muck about. And so I thought it wasn't a dose that I could detect any effects from it was better just to maintain an even course.
Yeah.
But, that didn't work eventually. So, c'est la vie.
Various times, because of stress and insomnia, I took a lot of Xanax, and I've always been an even keel kind of guy. And then I wasn't even keel. And I was like, why am I not even keel? And I was, I got a shrink for the first time. And then he's like, first thing is get off the Xanax.
Yeah.
And thankfully, it was, I could do it. And then I noticed a complete change. But like you said, I don't know what happened in Russia. It's like you're walking through a fog of time and just stuff is happening and you're existing, but you're not really there.
Well, they basically put me into unconsciousness long enough to get through the absolute worst of the withdrawal.
Mm-hmm. And how do you feel about that?
I'm here.
Right. But do you think it worked?
That's the best answer I've got. I'm not dead.
Right.
And most of that time I would have rather have been.
Do you think that's depression, anxiety, genetic, or caused by the
I think it was a complicated combination of all those things. I mean, what befell me is technically known as akathisia, which most people who suffer from akathisia describe it as the worst torture they've ever encountered by a lot, and that was certainly the case for me.
What are the symptoms?
Imagine being jabbed with a cattle prod continuously for 3 years. Complete inability to stay still.
So to go back to Bulgakov, you've reached your own master-like abyss in Russia, where he had his abyss. What did that teach you about good and evil?
I learned something about good, I would say. I had a lot of support from my family and my friends. The amount of care I got and the amount of goodwill I received from people all over the world was beneficial and profound. My family stuck by me, and so did my friends, and it was pretty brutal going. My wife was dying of cancer at the same time, and my daughter was suffering from a degenerative arthritic disease, but we hung together. Pain is real, but love is more real than pain. So that's a good thing to learn.
Your wife, you described there was a miracle that happened there. What happened?
She was diagnosed with cancer in 2018, and the initial diagnosis was of a relatively benign form of kidney cancer, very slow growing and unlikely to be fatal, even if allowed to progress. She had a biopsy and then initial surgery, and a number of symptoms recurred. And so we went back to the physician after a month, and they said they'd made a mistake in the biopsy and that she had a very rare form of cancer that killed every single person who ever had it, which was only about 200 in 10 months, and that surgery or chemo was unlikely to be useful. So we chose the surgical route and had a highly qualified team in Toronto who did their job well, although the surgery cascaded her into a series of very serious and likely fatal side effects. And so she basically starved to death for about 9 months and until those side effects rectified themselves on the date of our 30th anniversary. It's very difficult to know what to make of it, really. I mean, she was following a carnivore diet for much of the time that she had the cancer to begin with, and there's some evidence that such diets slow the progression of cancer. Cancer is very metabolically active and likes glucose. There was the surgery, of course. There was the consequence of her developing faith during that period of time.
She converted to Catholicism?
Yes.
Now this episode is brought to you by Zippix nicotine-infused toothpicks. Zippix bring you a satisfying, convenient, and great-tasting way to curb your nicotine cravings. Nicotine satisfaction, no smoke, no mess, just a pick. Now flavors are freaky, cinnamon, peppermint, even mojito, if you're feeling fancy. And if you're nicotine-free, Zippix has caffeine and B12 picks, so you can keep the oral fixation and ditch the lung abuse. Now give your lungs a break and try Zippix nicotine-infused toothpicks. Ditch the cigarettes, ditch the vapes, and get some nicotine-infused toothpicks at zippixtoothpicks.com today. Get 10% off your first order by using the code SHANE, S-H-A-N-E, at checkout, and your lungs will be glad you did. Must be 21 or older to order. Warning, nicotine is an addictive chemical. Zip more, smoke less with Zippix nicotine toothpicks. Spring is in full bloom on DraftKings Casino. New offers and promos are sprouting up daily. For example, right now, new players can play $5 on anything and get 350 casino spins instantly on featured slot games. Just like that. No catch, just a ton of spins to mess around with one of their featured slots. Download the app and sign in with code SHANE, that's SHANE, and take the featured slot for a spin and explore thousands of others on the DraftKings game library. Check back daily to claim the hottest offers and promos on DraftKings Casino. The crown is yours, baby.
Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. Please play responsibly. 21 and over. Physically present in Michigan, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, West Virginia only. Void in Connecticut and Ontario. Eligibility restrictions apply. New customers only. Non-withdrawable casino spins valid for featured game only and expire in 168 hours. See terms at casino.draftkings.com/promos. Ends June 15th, 2025 at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time.
And you, what's your religion today?
That's a difficult thing to say. I mean, I've written about what I believe and spoken about what I believe continually. It's a complicated issue. I think that what belief means is what people usually mean when they say belief. Belief is what you stake your life on, not what you say.
Mm-hmm.
And so what do I believe? I believe that the government shouldn't have control of your tongue.
Sure.
So is that a religious belief? Well, one of the presuppositions of the West is that the creative word is the divine origin of being. So, yeah, I'd say that's a religious belief.
Mm.
What happens if the cat gets your tongue? Everything goes to hell.
Well, so we've made a segue from religion to censorship, but great. So we come from Canada, and, when I was in the beginning days of Vice, it was funny because we were in Quebec and they were trying to separate from Canada, Jacques Prézo, and so they made English illegal, and we were an English language only magazine. And I remember giving my business card to someone, which was English language only, and they were like, that's illegal, so
Yeah.
It was a crazy time. B, we were sort of the Sex Pistols theory of marketing, which is get banned and go to number one.
Mm-hmm.
And we got banned quite a bit in Canada. We got censored a lot. So I'm very anti-censorship, and then came down to the States, and it's obviously different than First Amendment, et cetera, et cetera. What are your experiences? I know there is a lot of them, but let's say give me your top 2 or 3 that were formative with you in censorship.
Well, I haven't been censored so much as reputation savaged, I would say. My arrival on the public scene had to do with Bill C-16 in Canada, and Bill C-16 was the Trudeau bill that mandated pronoun usage. And I knew 2 things from the clinical perspective when that bill was formulated, and something politically as well. I knew that no Western country had ever mandated voluntary language use before, and they did to some degree with commercial language use. You can compel cigarette manufacturers, for example, to put a warning on their packages. You could legislate limits to speech, but you couldn't compel speech. And what people didn't understand about Bill C-16 was that it was a compelled speech bill.
So it's a baptism by fire.
You might say that.
And so you've been in academia, obviously Harvard, U of T, et cetera. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently. When you study, it seems that universities, a lot of the professors are on the left, and
almost all of them.
Almost all of them. And so when you're young and you're learning,
I didn't think I was on the right. I hadn't really been playing a game that was political. I mean, when I was a kid back in Alberta, I ran for vice president of the provincial NDP when I was 14, and I just about got elected. I was very interested in politics, at least in principle.
NDP, for everybody who doesn't know, is a sort of leftist environmental.
Yeah, it was a working class party at the time. It was a labor union party, really. That's where it's reasonable for labor to have a party.
Sure.
They don't now, but it's reasonable for them to have a voice, that's for sure. And the person who ran the NDP in Alberta, Grant Notley, was a pretty he had a good reputation, which is why he got elected in Alberta. He was the only opposition member in Alberta, right? And he wasn't elected because he was a socialist. He was elected because he was a good guy.
Yeah.
I had the ability to have a political career, but I discovered early on that the answer to the question that I was asking, which was the question of the source of evil, let's say, it wasn't, the political level wasn't the right level of analysis. It's not a political issue. It might not even be a psychological issue, but psychology is closer. It's really a theological issue, almost by definition, because the issue of good and evil puts you in the theological landscape.
Yeah.
But psychology steps closer to it than political science, which I discovered when I took my political science degree. And so I spent my career lecturing about totalitarian evil, but not only totalitarian, also psychological. And that wasn't political. And so I never ran afoul of the students at Harvard or the University of Toronto until this Bill C-16 scandal erupted.
I find it interesting because why do you think it is that academia is mostly to the left? And, when I was in university, having many professors who were Marxist was normal. And I remember, I don't know who it was, I can't remember, but they wanted to have a sort of right-wing speaker come, and I was in poli-sci, and then they didn't have him come and debate. And I'm like, why can't we put somebody up? Why can't we have a debate? Do we not have somebody who can? And I remember that led to fear. And why are you afraid of thoughts? Like, why are you afraid of having a debate that we're all going to then all of a sudden turn into right wing Nazis or something? Like, why not just let him come talk to one of your Marxist superstars? And I never got an answer for that. A, that stuck with me, and B, when you learn in university, that sort of sticks with you for life. So it's like, oh, that's the truth that I learned. And then when you get out into the world, it's like fake news or this or that or what have you, and you question things and what have you. But the stuff that you learned in school is school. So when you relearn, if you will, it has to be bashed out with a hammer, right?
Well, I think it was reasonable to some degree to have the universities play a counter position to the free market / corporate world that dominated North American, European society outside the university. So there's that. The universities could play a critical role. And I think they did that actually pretty effectively from the end of the Second World War, let's say, maybe even earlier than that, but at least then until maybe around 2010, 2011, things started to slip sideways pretty badly. Now, it's also the case that open / creative people, and so those might be people who are more likely to pursue an intellectual path, let's say, and to be interested in ideas. They're also more likely to be more progressive in their political views, just on the basis of their temperament. And the reason for that likely is that if you're smart and creative, you can risk not being conservative. If you can make it on your creativity, you don't have to do what everyone else does. Now, if you can't, you better do what everyone else does. And that's why the bulk of people, almost by definition, are conservative. If you aren't exceptional, you should be conservative. You might say, well, are university professors exceptional? And the answer to that is to some degree, because they're selected for high levels of general cognitive ability. They're smart. Now, that doesn't make them wise, and it doesn't make them moral, but it is a form of exceptionalism. And to thrive in an academic environment, you have to be intelligent enough to be competitive with other intelligent people and to come out on top. Now, what probably started to happen in the 60s, but it didn't really turn into a runaway freight train until 2010, is that a positive feedback loop of sorts emerged in the university so that the left-wingers were only hiring other left-wingers. And that was true at the faculty level, but also even more radically at the administrative level. And, well, that just got completely out of control. And I think I don't see that the universities are salvageable. I just went and spoke at the Oxford Union 2 nights ago, and it was just a horror show as far as I was concerned. I was so happy to not be a university professor.
How was it a horror show?
Well, the union itself was the president of the union, and the people who ran it, as far as I could tell, were Gaza supporting, Palestinian supporting adherents, let's say, with a political agenda of exactly that sort. His questioning of me, because it was a question and answer session, started out very hostile and purposefully so, planned in a planned manner. And despite the fact that they were quite polite to me before the event and also after, all in the name of good fun. And, fair enough, to some degree, assuming that's true, which it really isn't.
It was like you got sandbagged.
Oh, definitely. Well, not successfully, I might say. So I'm quite convinced that when they release the video that we'll see who put who on the spot. We'll see. But after the event, we went with the Muslim group into the old library that's part of the Oxford Union heritage, you might say. And there was a huge pride flag flying there. And I thought, yeah, that's the bloody university. Palestinian flag waving protesters and pride flag advocates. Now, there are no two more unlikely bedfellows than those two groups. But it doesn't matter because that's how mixed up the universities are. And a number of the people who asked me questions, not all of them, some of the students asked genuine questions. We had a real discussion. A genuine question is actually one you want the answer to because you're curious, right? Rather than a question designed to set you up to have your reputation destroyed. And a number of the questions, virtually all of the questions I was asked, except by this handful of genuine students, were exactly of that sort. Questions that are really, they're cluster B psychopathology oriented. And
yeah, well, this is called Shane Smith Has Questions, and I have questions, but you do, I guess you fight a lot or you debate a lot or you seem pretty angry. Do you think you're angry or you have to fight too much so you're like Rocky, you're always sort of ready to go?
No, I don't think so. It depends on where I am. I mean, no, in that situation, it's intolerable.
If you get sandbagged.
I don't go there.
Right.
I mean, I rarely go to speak at universities. I can't understand why anyone would. Virtually every time I go to speak at a university, there's a protest about that develops behind the scenes before I even get there. And then the people who are maneuvering to ensure that things are difficult for me do everything they can to make it procedurally difficult, right? Like prohibitively difficult. The probability that there'll be something approximating a demonstration is extremely high.
So why do it?
Well, because I hate to see the universities collapse. Mm-hmm. Not that me going to speak there is going to save them, but, I loved teaching at Harvard. Harvard's a great place in the 90s. It was thriving like mad, and most of the time I spent at the University of Toronto was very positive. I loved going to McGill. I don't
great school.
I don't take any pleasure in watching these great legacy institutions devour themselves and disappear into a rat hole of idiot progressivism. I think it's terrible. And so I suppose when I do it, it's partly because I'm invited, but also partly because I have a certain obligation to it. Most of the time, though, if I want to speak to a broad audience, I can just rent a theater and 5,000 people will come and they're happy to be there and I can say what I want. And
go online and millions of people.
Well, right. So I go to universities. I was at Cambridge just before that, and the Cambridge group was very hospitable. And they have been fairly consistently, although I got canceled at Cambridge quite famously. And
I'm not, tell me.
I was invited to give a seminar at Cambridge on the biblical book of Exodus, mm-hmm. which I eventually did with the Daily Wire with a better group of professors that I would have at Cambridge, including some of the Cambridge people. And I was invited to go, and it was all set up, and the university had contracted with my university to make it possible. And then I found out on Twitter that I'd been canceled mm-hmm. with no explanation and in a very rude manner. And that caused a big scandal at Cambridge, and they revamped their free speech code at university-wide. All the professors voted on it. Biggest show of professors since World War II. 80% of them voted in favor of mandating that what happened to me would never happen again. And then the people who generated that vote changed the law in the UK to make it illegal for any university to do that to anybody who was invited to speak at any university that I believe, I don't know if it's any university period or any university that receives centralized funding. Now, the Labour Party tried to eviscerate that bill when they came to power 6 months ago, but 700 academics and 7 Nobel Prize laureates put forward a petition and stopped them from gutting it. And so, see, that's another reason, at least in principle, to go unpleasant places. You know, the goal of the people who canceled me at Cambridge was to shut me up, but didn't really work because it backfired on them terribly. The whole university reconstituted, and then the law of the land changed. And then I did the seminar on the Daily Wire and got like 1,000 times, 100,000 more views than I would have had none of this ever occurred. Sometimes it's appropriate to put yourself in the line of fire because you believe that the medium to long-term consequences will be positive. And I'm not a fighty person. I don't like fighting with people at all. I'm a very agreeable person, which is partly why I became a clinical psychologist. I find argument even very stressful, but I find lying more stressful. I learned this as a clinical psychologist and also in my own private life, that silence when there's something to say is only trouble deferred and multiplied. And I also know enough about ancient mythology, which I've studied for a long time, to know that if you sweep one snake under the carpet and let it sit there, the next time you pull the carpet back, there'll be 10 snakes. Or they'll make a sudden appearance when you least expect it. And I wouldn't recommend that. So most of the time now, I go where I'm welcome.
Yeah.
Rather than into Daniel's den, let's say. But now and then, you know,
You do it. I mean, it's just, because if you know what's going to happen, and look, I don't know about you, but as I get older, it's the same. Like if you want to expand your brain, having a sort of rudimentary same old fight with the same old people is not the way to do it. The way to do it is to get, and, much like university, when you're at the PhD level, all the givens, we've read those books. We've talked about that. Now we're getting into the theoretical. Why do you think you're so polarizing to academia? Or to everybody, maybe?
Well, I actually don't think I am very polarizing. I think that I'm extremely polarizing to a very small number of extremely noisy people. But if you lived my life, you'd see that I'm out in public a lot, airports. I travel everywhere, and everywhere I go, people are very positive to me. I maybe have one encounter in 5,000 that's negative. I have security people, and we're careful, but all the interactions I have with people are ridiculously positive, which is why I keep touring. And the events are very, very positive. And my events aren't political. The people who think I'm their enemy think they're political, but they're not. But, the radical leftists, it's one of their shibboleths that the personal is political and that everything is political. And that's simply not true.
So I want to use that as a springboard because it seems to me that we've become highly politicized. So I'd say we were politicized before, but I would say in the last 20 years, it's gotten to be, we're kind of galvanized into inactivity. We can't move because everything's become so political, and here in America, Republicans are saying, well, not one vote for Democrats. Democrats, call everyone who's on the right a Nazi. It's become so highly politicized, like we were talking a little bit in the beginning, but obviously immigration's become such a highly politicized issue that there seems to be no basis of, consensus or medium or center. COVID was another one, environment, which I want to get into, but all of these things have become so politicized and it seems like it's only going to get worse. How do we go forward without just fighting all the time and undoing history, which is not... I was just talking to Mark Andreessen, who has a very positivist outlook on the world and the future, which is refreshing because when I graduated from university in Canada, I gave a talk about how I'd already lived in the biggest house I ever and the nicest car because they were my parents' car. And Generation X has been a dream. It's been economic upturn, no real wars, technological expansion, travel, food, like everything's gotten great. So we were saying, if you look at it based on life experience, my experience, why wouldn't I think that that's going to continue? Because what I've seen in my life was great, even though I thought it wasn't going to be when I was getting out of college. It seems, though, as if politically we're heading into a war that nobody can win. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think that destiny is fated. I think it depends on what we all decide to do. I think that, taking a page from Andreessen, the future could be one of unlimited abundance and prosperity for everyone if we decided to do that. I formulated a group called the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship in the UK. We just had our second conference last week. We had about 4,600 people from 90 countries attend, and we're attempting to put forward an invitational vision of the future that would appeal to classic liberals and conservatives, because I think they should be allied. They really have been historically allied. And as long as our enterprise has maintained its focus on a positive invitational vision, the events themselves are very positive, and we've got either neutral or positive press feedback, even from the legacy press, which is quite remarkable, with some exceptions, like The Guardian, but that figures. What's our vision? Cheap energy from all sources. Well, why? Well, because expensive energy particularly affects the poor, the absolutely poor, not the relatively poor, although it also affects the relatively poor. And the problem with keeping the poor poor is that the poorer people are, the harder they are on the environment. If you raise people's standard of living up to approximately $5,000 US per year in average GDP, they are now secure enough to start thinking over the long run. They start thinking about ecological preservation in their local habitat, for example, because they can start to think about their children and their grandchildren, because they're not scrabbling around in the dust trying to find enough dung to heat lunch if they're lucky to have any. And so the biggest impediment to economic advancement for the absolutely poor is energy. And so these green policies that drive up energy costs, as they have in the UK and Germany, are counterproductive beyond belief. As we know, the amount of pollution generated by Germany is now an order of magnitude greater than the amount of pollution generated by France for the same amount of power as a consequence of like 15 years of so-called green policies. And energy is 4 to 5 times as expensive. So Germany's deindustrializing. And what's the consequence? Well, China is building coal plants at a rate unprecedented, and so is India. It's foolish beyond comprehension. So cheap energy would be cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. You'd think the left could get behind that if they actually cared about the poor.
But, okay.
There's other policies, too, that are positive.
And so on a more macro level, so you again provide me a springboard, but on a macro level, so let's say if you look at what you were saying before about professors or people, if you are exceptional or whatever, you can look at things and their complexity and you can be exceptional. And if you're sort of not exceptional, then be conservative.
Yeah.
So if you look at it, you say, okay, I think things like, okay, smaller government. I always use this example, but like when I came down here, a young political scientist from Canada, and I saw, Clinton take the largest deficit of all time, turn it into the largest surplus through fiscal responsibility, shrunk the size of government, et cetera, et cetera. And then right after him, Bush increased the size of government, took the largest surplus to the largest deficit. You're like, hold on a second. It seems like the parties have swapped their pillars, right? And my problem with conservatism, and by the way, I have a lot of problems with liberalism too, but is this sort of adherence. Now, I saw Karl Rove talk to Rahm Emanuel about this, and he said, look, I wasn't political in university, but when I came out, the conservatives stayed on message and got behind their quarterback, and that's why I picked the Conservative Party. My problem with it is, like, you can say, okay, I want to shrink government. That to me is, yes, we should shrink government. We're seeing what's happening now. I think it's large and inefficient. Taxes. Well, the minute you put a tax on something, it's never going away. So they can say, I'm taxing you for the shoes, but it's only going to be for 5 years. 50 years from now, it's still going to be taxed. So I get it. Environment, look, I've been and I did this thing where I was in Greenland and I was reporting on Greenland melting, and then I got flooded, a lot of bots, a lot of things, flooded with negative comments. So I'm like, okay, fine. Went to the conservative think tanks, got all their things. Antarctica, fine. Went to Antarctica, talked to the glaciologists, and they're like, yeah, they're melting as fast as they can. They're kind of just sea level rise, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, well, why don't you say that then? They're like, well, I'm not a salesperson. I got papers that are just, they're published. And they're like, well, there's always going to be flat earthers. And I'm like, well, 45% of America believes that. No, to go to your point, why do conservatives have to have a blanket of everything? So, for example, we believe in this and fiscal responsibility and taxation and smaller government, and then environment gets thrown in there, and you're like, hold on a second. I've been to these places. I see how it's going. I get the cheap energy, and I understand that. There's a guy named Taylor Wilson who I filmed with a bunch. He's a physicist, and he's come up with these like miniature reactors that are completely fail-safe that can
small modular reactors.
Yeah, exactly. And they're
they're
covered
great.
in salt, so there can't be fallout basically. And they can do anywhere from 1 to 10,000 very cheaply. And so there are cheap energy, and the fusion that they're doing in France. I went there and reported on it. I agree with you on cheap energy. That's agreed. But the environment. I don't know why it's become such a conservative sort of I'm going to die on this.
Oh, because of net zero policy. Now, we shouldn't make this into a conservative issue, I wouldn't say, or a liberal issue for that matter. Well, the conservatives in the UK put in the net zero policies. So I think laying what I would describe as counterproductive and virtue signaling environmentalism at the feet of the progressives, let's say, it's not particularly helpful because it isn't just the progressives. The conservatives, as I said, implemented net zero policies, ruinously expensive policies after 20 minutes of debate in the UK. And they've scuttled the economy there, just as they have in Germany. So it's a much more it's a deeper problem than you might presume looking at the putative differences in policy in the classic political landscape. There's something much deeper going on. And I'm skeptical about the claims of the environmentalists because I think that the underlying spirit that motivates the entire movement emerged in the 1960s with the Club of Rome types who presumed that the optimal carrying capacity for the planet is 500 million people, if that. And that would be only if we existed in something like a quasi-agrarian state. And there's just too many people on the planet. And the question is, which people do you want to get rid of?
But again, and we can go down 700 rabbit holes, but the overarching truth is, which it's the hottest year every year, that we are exceeding our worst case scenarios every year. And look, I think the left and the right has propaganda. The funny thing is the left doesn't believe that their propaganda is propaganda. So I look at this stuff, but I have gone personally and reported on these things and seen it and talked to the conservative think tanks. The world is getting warmer. There are ramifications to burning fossil fuels. These things are happening globally. I understand the short-term economic problems and people not making intelligent decisions as politicians. But globally, I mean, all you have to do is go to Bangladesh, where you've had a third of the population move into cities because where they traditionally lived is sunk, and they're moving into these giant slums. That's going to happen everywhere as climate change increases. You're going to have a massive migration problem. If we don't deal with that rationally, we're going to be sitting on a crisis, no?
Well, we're already sitting on a variety of crises,
Sure,
and it's
yes.
very difficult to determine which one is the signal crisis. My sense, I'm a reasonably good scientist, and I can evaluate scientific literature. Now, I'm not a climate scientist, but climate scientist actually isn't a category, and neither is climate economist. And mostly what we have are unstable economic models projecting out 100 years, which is by no means possible under any circumstances whatsoever. You imagine an economist in 1850 trying to predict what the world was going to be like in 1950. It's like, no, that's not going to happen.
I'm familiar with budgets, and everyone budgets hockey stick growth in 3 years because nobody knows what's going to happen.
So you have economic models that model out the hypothetically catastrophic consequences of climate change, and I think they're just complete rubbish. And I've also spent a lot of time working with and attending to Bjorn Lomborg's work, and I don't think there is a more informed commentator on the economic consequences of climate change than Lomborg. And He's done a multidimensional analysis with the best economists in the world. And I think what Lomborg says is he believes that he's actually less of a climate change skeptic than I am. He accepts the IPCC's prognostications for global warming, and he's modeled out the economic consequences, and we'll be much richer than we are now in 100 years, given the current rates of growth, assuming that continues, and it might not, and we'll be somewhat less wealthy than we would have been had there not been climate change. And he's looked at the economic models and corrected them for the consequences of climate change. And so that's on the economic side. And then on the purely scientific side, when I look at the data, the one piece of information with regards to carbon dioxide in particular, and I'm by no means convinced that carbon dioxide overproduction is the worst of the environmental catastrophes that currently beset us. I would pick oceanic devastation far above carbon dioxide overproduction, but nobody cares about that, apparently.
Sure.
Well, I did a series of videos on oceanic overfishing because I looked at it in some detail about 10 years ago, and I made some pretty good videos, and they got no traction. It's just not an issue that, for whatever reason, it's not part and parcel of the current dialogue. And it's hard to tell exactly why that is. It's probably because all the environmental attention is focused on carbon dioxide overproduction. But my sense is the biggest single data point. Usually, if you look at any given phenomenon, there's a couple of major consequences to any causal chain, and then a variety of trivial consequences. And you really want to know what the major consequences are first. For example, the epidemic of chronic ill health that besets North America is basically attributable to insulin resistance.
Right.
That's a consequence of excess carbohydrate intake. Everything else is trivial. It's not that it doesn't matter, but that matters so much that that's what you should be attending to.
Right.
On the carbon dioxide side, the most overwhelming piece of data that's been collected is global greening. As the planet's greened 20% in the last 20 years. That's a consequence of carbon dioxide production. And almost all of the greening has occurred in semi-arid areas. And so the deserts are actually shrinking, and crop production has gone up 13%. Turns out that pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere is a very effective way of fertilizing plants. And so it's an area twice the size of the U.S., continental U.S., that's greened in the last 20 years. And the reason for that is that we're in a carbon dioxide drought by historical standards, and so that'd be over a 500 million year period. We damn near dipped down to the point where plants were going to start dying. Now, we pumped some carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and that upped their survival chances and the degree to which they thrived. And the reason for that is that if there's more carbon dioxide, the plants can close their breathing pores, and so they don't lose as much water, and then they can flourish where it's drier. So I look at the carbon dioxide data and I think, oh no, there's nothing that compares to global greening. All the rest of it's noise. The warming, everything else.
Well, okay, there's a lot of problems caused by carbon dioxide, one of them being the release of methane in Siberia, because there's so much methane trapped in the tundra that as it warms, it's releasing methane at an exponential level.
Yeah. I talked to Richard Lindzen, who's an MIT climatologist, and he's a very well-established scientist. First of all, he's at MIT. That's not an easy thing.
Sure, yeah.
And he's authored hundreds and hundreds of papers. And I talked to him about positive feedback loop theories because there's a couple of them. Runaway change in Greenland, for example, reversing of the Gulf Stream, runaway methane production.
You're saying that the Greenland melting is a positive
feedback loop.
Really?
Well, yeah. A positive feedback loop is an effect that reinforces itself, so it can run away. And you could say that one of the theories about methane overproduction is a positive. I don't mean positive in that it's good.
Right.
A positive feedback loop is a process that runs out of control because it starts to feed back on itself, reinforce itself. And so the permafrost melts, methane's released, the atmosphere heats, the permafrost melts faster, there's more you get a runaway cycle. And so I talked to Lindzen about that, and he's of the opinion that positive feedback loops of that sort are highly unlikely, and he has an entropy explanation for that. There's many ways that a system can go out of control, like a virtually infinite number of ways, and there's a very small number of ways it can go out of control and reinforce itself. So he thinks the chance of a positive feedback loop developing of the sort that the climate apocalypse mongers terrorize us with is extraordinarily low. Now, is Lindzen right? I don't know.
What if he's wrong? Look, I mean, again, I've gone to these places and seen it firsthand, and you can see Greenland melting. And the other thing that you see is it's black, right? Because all of the soot from the fires. And what happens is the soot goes on the air, goes down and becomes black, which attracts the heat rather than pushes it off. So you can see it actually getting black, and then it gets heat, and it's melting rapidly. And I've been there myself, and I've seen it happening. In any case, we can move on because it'll just be you. I mean, that to me, it's one of my things.
Look, even if there is a problem, and I'm sure there's many problems, and the problem is that the reaction to a problem can be far worse than the problem. There is no evidence whatsoever that the idiot panic over carbon dioxide has done anything whatsoever except to make the situation worse. Germany is deindustrializing. It's not good. Their economy is tumbling, as it is in the UK. The Brits and the Germans now make 60 cents for every dollar the Americans make, and it's the same for Canada. And what's been the consequence of that? Well, Germany isn't greener. In fact, it pollutes more. Germany produced this parallel power system, wind and solar, in Germany. It's not the world's sunniest country. Parallel power system. Well, the problem with a renewables power system is you have to have a parallel power system because it's not reliable. And power has to be on 100% of the time, without fail, especially if you're an industrial economy, because there are industrial processes that are complex that, if interrupted, fail cataclysmically and cannot be restarted. So to build a renewable power grid, you have to build a parallel power grid of the same size that can step in. Well, then you have to ask yourself, well, if you have the parallel power grid, why do you need the renewable? And that's especially true because Germany closed down its nuclear plants. God only knows why, because they don't emit any carbon. And so they had to use coal as a backup because you can't bring nuclear power back online fast enough to fill in the wind droughts, which are plentiful. And so they started burning not only coal, but lignite, right, which is the dirtiest form of coal. And so now Germany has energy that's 5 times as expensive, approximately. They're dependent on the bloody Russians and the Arabs, which is not good for Germany. And they pollute more. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't care what criteria you use to judge that process. It's a failure. And so I don't think the proper debate really is about whether or not carbon dioxide is a net good or a net harm. Change itself is complex, and there is a change in atmospheric composition. That isn't the question. The question is whether the panicked response to that has been productive or counterproductive. And I don't see any evidence that it's been productive.
Well, I'm going to say that I agree that the human reaction has been inept and not...
I think it's been malevolent, not just inept, because it is grounded in this club of zero presumption that there are too many people on the planet. That's a dangerous presumption. When a political voice speaks to you and says, well, we think there are too many people, you have to ask, well, just exactly what's your mechanism for dealing with that?
Well, that's another question. What I'm saying is, I believe, and we can go on for hours about environmental degradation. However, has the response been harmful, and has it been comprehensive, and has it been inept? Yes. So there we go. Hopefully France works. We have fusion and it's free power, and we use it to pull people out of the pool.
But one of the mysteries, and I'll leave it after this. Yeah. I mean, see, it'd be nice to take the environmentalists at face value. The environmentalists, there's many kinds of environmentalists. Sure. Like RFK is an environmentalist. I
want to get to that too.
Be good to take them at face value.
Mm-hmm.
But here's one of the things that mitigates against that for me. I cannot for the life of me understand why the Greens in Germany shut down the nuclear plants.
Mm-hmm.
Look, if you're concerned about carbon dioxide and you think it's the harbinger of the apocalypse, I don't believe that to be true. But let's say that people of goodwill could presume that. It's like, okay, so what's your problem with nuclear exactly?
Well, because there's fallout no pun intended, because you have all of the uranium and plutonium tailings, which we cannot contain and store correctly. And also, quite frankly, they were used to make weapons which nearly destroyed the world or had the potential for mutually assured destruction. So it became a political issue, much like we were talking about before. It became a political issue that wasn't necessarily about the energy, but about all the other things that came with it. And I grew up during that time when this became a hotbed of political issue, and I think a lot of it stemmed out of the Cold War, which was raging furiously.
It did. And people were afraid of nuclear.
And Germany was the front lines of the Cold War, highly politicized, right? And they were right there. So I think that it wasn't a pure issue when it was just about energy. Right. And that's why there was a lot. And again, like, people voted.
But it doesn't matter if you think that carbon dioxide is going to usher in the apocalypse. It doesn't matter what else you're preoccupied with.
That was a more imminent sort of doom, because it was, okay, if we keep on making the means to blow up the world, 1,000 times over, then, what are we doing? So your argument is, and again, I'm not an arguer. I like to ask guys that it's bad for poor people, which I probably agree with. But, and how do we pull poor people out? But using energy efficiency, but because that's a more immediate demand than maybe in 100 years this is going to be like this. Okay, I get that argument.
Well, what we've done to countries to places like Africa is absolutely unconscionable.
100%.
It's the worst form of neocolonialism. Yeah. You guys don't get fossil fuels.
Because we burn them.
And continue to do so, while China is industrializing at a rate that dwarfs anything the rest of the world is doing.
100%. We got a lot more to get to. I want to talk about China. You mentioned RFK. Let's do RFK first, because, again, environmentalist, a controversial figure. We talked about the right and the left. He seems to be one that came from the left, now is the right. Maybe he can do a lot of things that other people couldn't have in the past. What are your thoughts on RFK? And then, before we forget, because let's talk about China and how the future of America v. China, which is probably the modern America v. Soviet Union from back in the day.
Well, RFK is a complicated person.
Yeah.
He's complicated personally, and he's complicated intellectually.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that he's on the right now, because I don't think Trump is a conservative. Trump isn't a conservative. Tulsi Gabbard isn't a conservative. Elon Musk isn't a conservative. Joe Rogan isn't a conservative.
Sure.
Like Rogan, and that's a particularly good joke. He's the most preposterous conservative you could possibly ever imagine. He's not temperamentally conservative. He's a comedian, first of all, and generally speaking, comedians aren't conservative. And, he's a hallucinogenic advocate. There's almost no one you could conjure up that's less conservative than Rogan. And RFK is also a good example of that. He's entrepreneurial in his personality. He's a crazy bastard, just like Musk. And like Vivek Ramaswamy, for that matter. These people are by no means classic conservatives. They're certainly not classic Republicans, and the same can be said for Trump. So I don't know how you characterize the current White House politically, but using the normal rubric of right and left just doesn't work at all. And so what do I think of RFK?
Yeah.
Well, I've met him a number of times. He's very smart. He's very tough physically. He's a disciplined person. He's got a checkered past. He's fallen prey to
addiction,
a variety of different temptations, and seems to be doing his best to stay on top of them.
Yeah.
And there's some advantage to that, I think.
He's a human being.
Yeah, and if you're good because you're naive and you've never dared to do anything bad, you're not exactly good. You're just naive.
Sure.
And RFK is a bad man who's trying to be good. And that's about as good as a good man gets.
He stared into his own abyss.
I would say
he's
so.
Come out the other side.
And he decided to ally himself with Trump, oddly enough, partly because I interviewed RFK twice, and the first time I interviewed him, I asked him a question I always asked Democrats when they would talk to me publicly, which was virtually never, despite having that offer on the table and having made it public. And
why do you think that is?
Oh, I don't think I know why.
Tell me.
Because they're afraid for their reputation if they dared sit down and talk to me. And they told me that. I talked to lots of Democrats in D.C.,
sure.
like plenty. And I've talked to some on my podcast, but they're only after they've been savaged by the Democrats themselves. So Dean Phillips, for example, who ran for president, eventually talked to me, and we had a very productive conversation. But the first time I talked to RFK, one of the questions I asked him was, when does the left go too far? Because that's a question Democrats need to answer and never will. Yeah. And he didn't. He said, I'm not running that kind of divisive campaign. But the next time I talked to him, which was about a year later, all he could talk about was when the left goes too far, because he ran face first into the progressive machine, and it wasn't pretty. And so they definitely forced him into the hands of Trump. Now, RFK believes, and I think with good reason, that Trump will give him carte blanche, essentially. And Trump's a very strange character, because he's got many of the personality characteristics that would tilt someone in the narcissistic direction. Like, every personality configuration has its associated pathology. Mm-hmm. So if you're agreeable and kind, you're likely to be dependent, for example. And if you're extroverted, and Trump is unbelievably extroverted, off the charts, and disagreeable, and he's also very disagreeable, then one of the pathologies that might tempt you is narcissism.
Right.
But Trump's a very weird narcissist, because the typical narcissist won't share the stage. Mm-hmm. So the fact that he's allied himself with the only person in the world who's more famous than him, that would be Elon Musk, and he's brought on Tulsi Gabbard and Vivek. These are all powerful personalities in their own right with their own following. Yeah. And certainly the same can be said of RFK. Yeah. He's brought them on board, and he leaves them the hell alone. It's very interesting to watch and very surprising. Mm-hmm. RFK is going to try to reform the health of Americans, let's say. It's a unbelievably complex undertaking. He doesn't have very much time. And the biggest danger that besets him, I think, has to do with the point we talked about earlier. When you're looking at a complex and serious problem, climate, let's say, or health, there's a multitude of contributing factors, but a couple of them are cardinal. Mm-hmm. Now, Kennedy's in the position already where the Maha movement has a variety of interest groups associated with it, and they all have their bugbears. Food additives, glyphosate, what else? Well, chemicals. Every chemical additive that you might find questionable has an advocacy group making that a primary concern. You have the vegans, you have the vegetarians. It's a very messy movement, and it isn't going to be simple for him to determine who he's going to please and who he's going to displease. Sure. I believe they should concentrate on excess carbohydrate intake, because I know that fuels insulin resistance, and that's a catastrophe. Mm-hmm. Obesity, heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, depression, anxiety, you name it. Insulin resistance is behind it. Maybe he could do something about that. He won't be able to do something about 20 things, not least because he'll have an array of enemies against him that'll tie him up in knots. They only have to tie him up in knots for 4 years, really. More power to him. He's a bull in the china shop, too. Like, Kennedy is a strange guy, He has a lot of ideas, which isn't common for politicians. And a lot of his ideas are original. And most original ideas are wrong, right? Most entrepreneurial ventures fail. Yeah. It's hard to be creative and correct. So most people who are creative, they're all over the place. Yeah. And if they're lucky, a couple of things work, right? And they persevere through their failures. Yeah. Trump has collected all these creative people around him. We've never seen anything like that in the political domain. God only knows what's going to happen. Yeah. We'll see. But I don't think using a conservative...
Well, it's interesting because, when you're a kid... When I was a kid, and you become a sort of punk rocker. I was a punk rocker. You come to school and you're different than everybody else, and they sort of push you, and you end up going from, I had a mohawk, to having facial tattoos and being a squeegee punk. Not that I have facial tattoos, but I think.
How are you with the squeegee?
Very fast.
Good.
But with Joe and Elon, who I know and respect, I think that they were put. I think if you know
Oh,
their
definitely.
history. And Trump was a Democrat. Joe was a Democrat. Elon.
Rogan voted for Bernie.
Yeah,
and interviewed him,
Yeah.
and they got a lot of hell for that
Yeah.
from the progressives.
Sure. So, but if you get pushed because you weren't liberal enough, or you did this wrong, or you did that wrong, or freedom of speech, or any of these things, and so you get pushed over. So they're pushed on the spectrum. But it's very interesting, and you, I think, had a great word, which is entrepreneurial. Because I say to people, like, why wouldn't you audit the government? Do you think the government's not bloated and inefficient and spending all your money? That's just your money. And like, there was just fires where I live, and there weren't any fire trucks. And I'm like, I pay the most taxes in the country next to Atherton, and I didn't have any fire trucks. So
Yeah, right.
So why wouldn't we look at what they're spending? Why would you ever say, let's not look at what they're spending in tax money? A. B, when it comes to RFK, why wouldn't you let them look at if children's cereal has carcinogens in it? Why wouldn't we want to look at that? I don't understand the...
Oh, it's so preposterous, because Kennedy is taking on, I don't know what's happened to the political landscape in the last 10 years, but we have the spectacle now of the left objecting to one of their own investigating large corporate conglomerates.
Right.
It's like, okay, I don't know what to make of that.
Yeah.
It's like,
well, it goes back to our original thing. If everything's become so politicized, it's like having a sports team. And I don't care if, you're Pittsburgh and I'm Philadelphia, whatever, I'm going to just say Philadelphia is right and Pittsburgh's wrong. I agree. Like, we have to be able to look at things logically and say, look, this is just a logical way of looking at something. And because your political party or your sports team says it, we have to have some logic, no?
we'll see.
There go the comment boards. Anyway, we don't have a ton of time. I want to get to China. So I think you want to talk about immediate, let's say, threats or problems, what's going on in Taiwan, the encirclement, what China's doing. There's sort of a silent Cold War that's been going on that's becoming less and less silent. If you go to Africa, we were talking about Africa, America has sort of lost Africa, and China's moved in very successfully at taking infrastructure gigs and paying for them, and then taking, minerals and rare earth minerals especially, but everything basically from Africa. And I see that, and I see that we're sort of heading towards this, Taiwan's our Poland, and, what do you see happening there?
Well, when I was 13 in Alberta, I went to a trade fair in Edmonton. It was the first time I'd ever been to anything like that. It was a Chinese trade fair.
Mm-hmm.
It was just after China had opened up trading relationships with the West. And there was Chinese industrial products on display there, and they looked like North American products from like 1952.
Yeah.
And everyone hoped that China could industrialize and stop its people from starving. And as they got richer and more integrated into the free market economy, that the precepts of the free world would become self-evident to the Chinese, and that they would moderate their pathologically totalitarian stance. And that was a reasonable experiment, especially given the fact that no one in their right mind wanted China to stay poor enough so that a substantial proportion of its population starved. And that stopped happening. I mean, when I was very young, there was still starvation in China, and there isn't now. And you could even say that opening up free exchange with China ameliorated the problem of absolute poverty in that country. And I think it was reasonable to run the experiment to see that whether or not, if you made a country like that integrated into the Western economy, that it might tilt towards freedom.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And now we know, okay, well, we're not sure what to do about that.
Yeah.
And it is extraordinarily complex, because is China a threat? Well, they support North Korea, so that's like a clue. And they're setting their society up in a manner that's so totalitarian that we can't even imagine it. There's 700 million closed-circuit television cameras in China. They use gait recognition.
And they're exporting that technology to others.
Of course they are, and we're foolish enough to be using it airports are always the harbinger of totalitarianism in the West. And we could easily, well, here's an example. I was just in the UK and my security team rented a truck. And the UK, in their wisdom, have knocked the speed limits there down to 20 miles an hour. And so your truck communicates with the signs. And every time you go 2 miles an hour over the goddamn speed limit, your truck beeps at you. You might say, well, calm down, Dr. Peterson. That really doesn't signify anything. It's like it signifies the all-seeing eye of the state. And if you're too goddamn blind to see it, that's not a consequence of my, what would you say, hypersensitivity to the totalitarian landscape. It's exactly what you'd expect. We'll be surrounded by machines that watch us. It's highly likely. That outcome is highly likely. It's more likely we'll go the Chinese direction than they'll go our direction. It's an easier pathway to slip down. And the Chinese, well, as I said, their cameras use gait recognition, so you can't even cover your face, right? They know where you are and what you're doing all the time. They've hooked that all up to a social credit system, and you are so screwed if your social credit system falls below the acceptable minimum that you might as well not even exist.
Right.
And so that's an awful scenario.
Yeah.
What are we going to do about it? We don't know.
Yeah.
Chasing the Russians into the hands of the Chinese isn't a wise initial move, I wouldn't say. And we've managed to do that quite successfully over the last 10 years. Now, what mitigates against that? The Chinese have their own problems, right? They're economically unstable. They have a cataclysmic birth rate. Their population is rapidly aging. In 10 years, it will be difficult for them to mount an army, although they have a very large number of people because their society is aging so dramatically.
Yeah, but they still have the
largest. It might be that we can wait them out, but we'll see.
Yeah.
Now, I would say at minimum, the Chinese communists, like bullies everywhere, respond quite well to formidable power.
Mm-hmm.
And luckily enough, the Americans have it still. And under Trump, they're likely to maintain it and use it. And I would say that should help people sleep better at night.
And to go back to the technology, which is interesting, is what you see now is China exporting the technology to, let's say, Africa, saying, hey, you want a system that can follow all your people and figure out where they're spending their money and what they're doing. You can have that system and we'll give it to you. They're not only doing it to their own people, they're exporting it to others. The interesting thing about Russia is if you have China and America, it's basically a two-horse race for quantum computing and AI, but Russia's not in that race. But Russia still has, the biggest stick on the block. Then Russia's going to have one, weapon to use against the people who have the quantum and the AI.
You mean the nuclear?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that to go back to the worries of the 80s.
The appropriate tack for the West to take is to get its house in order and outcompete the Chinese, just like we outcompeted the Russians.
Yeah.
There isn't a more effective solution than that, and I think the U.S. can do it. I mean, it's very dangerous to bet against the Americans, right? They reinvent themselves constantly and leap ahead. And so more power to them as far as I'm concerned. And
you keep going. I'm just looking at, because I have all these questions that I didn't get to again. And I'm going to go more to the hopeful, hopefully. As someone who's often critical of the modern world, do you have hope for the future? What do you think is the most crucial thing that humanity should focus on now?
Well, I think we're in a situation where we're able, for the first time, to understand explicitly the metaphysical foundations of our culture.
Mm-hmm.
We've been trying to sort that out really since the end of World War II. Well, longer than that, but it's become a hot-button issue after the Second World War, let's say, in consequence of the Cold War. What are the proper metaphysical foundations for a society?
Mm-hmm.
The communist system obviously doesn't work. The fascist system doesn't work. The religious totalitarian system doesn't work. Whatever the West is founded on seems to work well enough so that everybody who wants to escape from somewhere wants to come here. So that's some evidence for its quality. Now, if you're a cynical Marxist, you might say, well, the only reason the West is rich is because it exploited the rest of the world. But, I think that's an insane theory, so I'm not even going to bother criticizing it. The West is successful, as far as I'm concerned, for the same reason that Japan is successful. And the West is successful because it's produced something approximating a high-trust society. And I think that high-trust society is integrally associated, at least in the rest of the West, with the Christian doctrines that gave rise to the Free West originally. And part of what I've been working on is to make explicit the relationship between those doctrines and the functional quality of Western society. So I can say something concrete about that. So you could imagine a society that was based on desire, right? So that would be hedonistically oriented society. And Western materialism tilts in that direction.
Sure.
But hedonistic societies can't sustain themselves particularly well, because if you're pursuing your own immediate pleasure, well, first of all, you have the problem of immediacy and impulsivity. You'll do foolish, fun things in the present for which you'll pay dreadfully in the future.
I'm familiar.
Right. Anybody who's lived a little bit learns that.
Yeah.
Right. That's why William Blake said wisdom through excess.
Mm-hmm.
Right, because you learn.
Yeah.
Okay, so the hedonistic route doesn't work, and I think it's because it not only is it self-defeating in that it sacrifices the future to the present, but it's also essentially antisocial, because if it's all about me and what I want now, it's not about you.
Sure.
And so,
it also sacrifices the vessel eventually.
Yes, exactly. Right. How much of that can you maintain? Certainly. And so that's the sacrifice of the future, really. Another potential uniting force or foundation, you might say, is power. And power can unite, but it's unstable. It doesn't transition well from one powerful individual to another. And it's not particularly efficient because it has to use up a lot of its energy in enforcement. Well, you can see a dance between hedonism and power, let's say. That's sort of the postmodern world, that dance between hedonism and power. And then you might ask, if there's another principle that is foundational, that isn't desire-focused, and that isn't predicated on power, and there is another principle, and that's the principle of voluntary self-sacrifice. And that is the principle upon which the functional societies of the West are predicated, and that's right. It's right. It's technically right even. And part of what Christianity literally dramatizes, is the principle of voluntary self-sacrifice as the foundation of abundant, free, and psychologically integrated peoples and societies. And so partly what I'm trying to do in my writings is make that clear, make what that means clear. So any social relationship is sacrificial. So if I want to have you as a friend, it can't only be about me. I have to take turns with you, and hopefully we can structure our relationship so the consequence of our sacrificial interactions is that we both achieve more than we would if we were solitary. That's sort of the presumption of a marriage, right?
Yeah.
You give up something to your wife, and you give up something for your wife, and she does the same. And the deal, the covenant, is that all things considered, over the longest conceivable span of time, you benefit, and you establish a foundation for children, and they benefit, and that benefits society, but you mature and you sacrifice. That's the right principle. Now, that is dramatized in the Old and the New Testaments, are dramas of sacrifice aimed at the specification of the proper mode of sacrifice, and that's exemplified in the New Testament dramas. And I think we're now in a position where we can understand that. Understand two things. We understand first that life is a drama. Life is a story. It's not a pathway that can be derived from the mere objective facts. The Enlightenment types were wrong. They were wrong about that. That's why we have a culture war in part. That's why the postmodern critique was actually effective, because the postmodernists, who I don't admire particularly for a variety of reasons, they were right about one thing. They were right about the fact that we see the world through a story. Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah.
And so once you know that, the next question that emerges is, well, what's what's the story then? What's the story going to be? What is the story? What should the story be? And I think, as I said, I think we've advanced enough in our investigations of human psychology, let's say, or even evolutionary biology, that we can now make that clear. And so I think if we do understand that, people will sort themselves out and will make the future a place of peace and abundance. I think we can do that. It's going to require large-scale transformation of attitude at the psychological level, though not at the political level, not top-down like the WEF might have it, but at the level of the individual. And part of the reason that I continue to tour and to speak to people everywhere is to catalyze that. And that's successful. I mean, I told you at the beginning of this talk that the interactions I have with people in my day-to-day life are resoundingly positive. Typically people come up to me and say that they follow my work in writing or on YouTube, let's say. And, they kind of are generically thankful about that. But I usually ask them, it's like, what made a difference and how? And then they get personal, right? And then they tell me, their lives were disordered in some of the many ways that people's lives could be disordered. And they started to try to develop something approximating a vision and to aim up and to maybe be a little more careful with their words and to put their marriage together or their families, and that's working. And they're thrilled about it. And it's great. It's great. It's wonderful. And I've spoken to tens of thousands of people that's happened to. And I think that will continue to happen. I think we know now, for example, that there's a tilt among young men more in the conservative direction. It's measured wrong. They're not becoming more conservative. They're becoming more traditional. That's not the same thing. It's not a political phenomenon. It's deeper than the political. They're starting to understand that the meaning in their life is going to be derived through responsibility, not through hedonic self-gratification, let's say, or not the application of power. And they're starting to act that out. Now it's dividing them from young women quite radically, like the division in metaphysical presumption between young men and young women is at an all-time high at the moment. But the young women will follow. We make a mistake, we measure the attitudes of young men and young women of the same age. Well, young men and young women of the same age don't associate together. Young men associate with women who are about 4 years younger. So that's not a good comparison. And where the men go, the women will follow. So eventually.
Do you know the movie Sexy Beast?
Yes.
Okay.
The man who played Gandhi played that.
Ben Kingsley is the bad guy.
He did a great job
he
in
did
that.
A great job. When he talks, he's like, no. He's like, headbutts you.
Yeah.
To me, when you talk philosophically and theoretically and theologically, you sit back and you sort of look off and you're sort of starry-eyed dreamer. And when you get into your fighty, classic and this law did this, you get sort of Ben Kingsley-ish. That is fighty. And I want to thank you for coming today, Mr. Jordan Peterson. But in the future, I want to see the starry-eyed, mystical dreamer and less of the...
Well, you said, you said during our conversation that you asked me if I was angry. And, the answer to that...
When you get on a script, you seem a little bit angry.
Well, there's two things there's two situations where that comes out, likely. One is, it's very difficult for me to talk about my illness, and because it was unbelievably awful, incomprehensibly awful for me and my family. And so even to talk about that takes some psychological effort, and anger's a wellspring of energy, just like John Lydon said, right?
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anger is an energy.
That's for sure. And he knew that. He was really good at that. I guess that's maybe part of what attracted you to the punk rock milieu to begin with.
There you go.
Yeah, well, and fair enough,
Yeah.
Anger transmuted is a very useful force.
Sure.
And then it's also prohibitively difficult. You could learn it, but it's very difficult not to use anger as a source of energy when you're attacked. Now, you didn't attack me today. I'm not saying you did, but we did talk about Oxford, for example. It was very stressful.
Right.
Like, it's very hard to go to, and I'm not complaining. because it's also an opportunity. And certainly the journalists who've done me the most favors in the last 6 years were the ones who came after me, hammer and tongs.
Yeah.
Right. But it's tricky psychologically to manage that. And one source of energy to draw on is anger. Now, is that the optimal source? Look, if you were Christ himself, I suppose you could manage attack with graciousness, love, and equanimity. But I'm not sophisticated enough to do that 100% of the time by any stretch of the imagination, and it is better. We see this with this ARC enterprise, is if we tilt partisan, if we start to become critical of the other side, whatever that is, then we lose the audience, the press turns against us, and no one wants to watch anything on YouTube. Yeah. If we can maintain our emphasis on a positive vision that unites, it goes like a charm.
Yeah.
And I try to do that. I certainly do that in my tours. And, well, you learn to do better at what you're doing as you proceed along. So.
All right. On that note, thank you very much for your time today. How's your wife doing now, by the way?
She's doing great.
So
she's firing in all cylinders.
That's the real story of today.
Yeah, it's great. It's a lovely thing to see.
Well, that's the best news. So thank you very much for your time today.
You bet. Nice talking to you. Thanks for the invitation.